Everyone, and welcome to Getting In, a college coach conversation. If you enjoy this podcast, please help others find us by reviewing us on Apple Podcasts. The more reviews we get, the higher we rise, and the more likely it is that people looking for information on college admissions will find us. So please do that. Today we are focusing on answering your questions, but before we get to that, we are going to talk about interviews. And who better to have as a guest than my colleague, Elise Krantz. Hi, Elise.
Hey, Beth.
Hi. And I do want our listeners to know that today is your birthday. So of all of the things you could have chosen to do on this day, you're choosing to spend at least part of it with us. So thank you for that.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
All right, so why is it so perfect that Elise is here? Well, she's a former admissions officer at Barnard and Bennington colleges. But aside from that, she also was an alumni interviewer at Dartmouth, and she managed the alumni interview process at Barnard, which involved training the interviewers and assigning interviews. And then for good measure, she also conducts dozens of mock interviews each year here at College Coach. So if ever there was one person I might turn to on the team as an expert in the college interview process, Elise, I think you win the title.
I'm happy to hold it. It's common applications and interview skills. Like, that's my thing. Yep.
These are good things to be your thing. All right, well, why don't we start with a question that I get a lot, which is, do colleges still interview students? How common is this?
So COVID aside, yes, many colleges are still interviewing students. Due to pandemic restrictions, a lot of colleges have pivoted mostly to Zoom interviews if they are still conducting them. But you'll still find that the colleges that have been offering them in recent years generally are still doing it. It varies, though, on the types of schools. So you'll find generally that very large public universities are not necessarily going to offer interviews. Right. There may be exceptions, of course. Very common in the interview landscape, you'll find smaller liberal arts colleges. They tend to do it a lot. And some of your, not all, but a good handful of the more selective colleges, both small and medium-sized, will offer interviews.
Okay, great. So let's start with, how do you find out if the schools on your list are interviewing?
So you can go to the website. That would be the easiest place. On the admissions site, on usually the first year application information, you'll see or not see information about an interview listed there. Sometimes you have to do a little digging. Sometimes I might just do a good old fashioned internet search and I'll say, Boston University admissions interview, and see if anything pops up. And sometimes students have to be proactive. They have to actually request the interview in order to be contacted by the school. At other institutions, simply applying to the school triggers that process and they will automatically be contacted. So you do want to do your research ahead of time to see if you need to make that first step to request the interview.
And actually, this takes me to a good point that I want to bring up, especially because you were an alumni interviewer at Dartmouth. I was an alumni interviewer at Cornell. The process when it's alumni interviews, and this is something that a lot of the most selective schools use, there are some nuances to that. Can you talk us through a little bit of that piece around how you get one of those interviews? Does everyone get an interview? What does it mean if you don't get an interview?
So there are different types of interviews. The on-campus interview, if those are offered at the schools that students are looking at, they tend to be given by admissions officers who work there or by seniors at the college who have been trained to give interviews. If it's not on campus, it's likely going to be offered by an alumna or alumnus of the institution. These are volunteers, graduates of the school who love their alma mater. They love being able to talk to prospective students. They have been trained technically by the admissions office.
Some better than others.
They're supposed to go through a training process so they know what to ask, what not to ask. And for most, whether it's on campus or off campus, most colleges will tell you they are weighted equally. It's just going to be a positive addition to your application. If you don't get asked for an alumni interview, usually it's simply because they didn't have enough volunteers to offer you one. And it's not seen as a negative if you were not offered one in the first place.
Right, which I think leads to a lot of agita for students, especially if you're at a particular high school where a lot of students are applying. I can think of schools where maybe we might have 50 applicants to Penn in a given year from one high school, and then maybe half the kids would be offered interviews, and they would all automatically assume that that was the only half we were considering. And then decisions would come out, and maybe a couple of people who didn't interview would get offered and spots, and a couple of people who did would get offered spots. And I know it threw everyone into a tizzy. It's truly luck of the draw at many of these schools. And if you don't get an interview, it is not a reflection, typically, of their interest in you as an applicant or not. So,
For sure. Yep.
all right. So that's an important point. And also important is that at the Ivies and the highly selectives, they typically do not interview at all on campus. There is not usually an opportunity for you to talk to an admissions officer in an interview setting. All right, here's a big one. And this is who should interview? And more to the point, is there anyone who should not interview?
Sometimes I meet a student, it's like a one-on-one session, a counseling call, and I know instinctively you would be an amazing candidate to interview.
Yes.
You're energetic, you show passion and enthusiasm for what you discuss. Those, it's sort of like having a theater background, like you're on stage, you have presence. Obviously students who feel comfortable speaking with adults, who have that excitement for school and learning and want to share that, those for sure would be great, and those students should look for interview opportunities. Colleges will generally say that it's very hard to have a negative interview that will truly hurt your application. So even a student who maybe isn't super outgoing or a great talker, but is simply, just a good old, typical student who wants to demonstrate interest, that's not going to hurt you by any stretch. There are students, of course, who have severe anxiety, who get so nervous about the thought of having an interview might really negatively impact their application, because they would get so flustered they couldn't represent themselves well. So maybe for those students, I would say maybe hold off if you can and try to avoid those opportunities. But for most students, it's a positive in their application.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And where even if you're not setting the world on fire in the interview, like one of those students you talk about who has presence, the fact is that they understand they're talking to teenagers, and teenagers have a wide variety of ability to connect with adults. And I do believe and have seen people take that into consideration. So I would agree that unless it's extreme, it seems to me like if you can interview, you should.
Mm-hmm.
What kinds of questions are interviewers typically going to ask, right? It's all well and good for us to say it's just going to be a positive addition to your application, but if you have no idea what to expect, it might be hard to imagine how that could be. So maybe talk us through some of the types of questions that interviewers ask.
Sure. So the questions that I asked at Barnard and when I was an alumni interviewer for Dartmouth are pretty similar. They both, and I think this is going to be across the board for any type of school. First and foremost, they want to know about your interests academically. They want to know what you're motivated by. Are you intellectually curious? What have you enjoyed in high school? And what are you looking forward to studying in college? So that's like the academics. For sure, they're going to ask you about that. They'll also ask about your extracurricular commitments, whether it's in school, in your community, just your personal motivation in getting involved, and the kind of impact you've had both in high school and the impact you would like to have in college. You'll notice a theme here. It's not just what you've done, but what you hope to bring to your future school. The next category is a little more nuanced. It's more they're trying to figure out your character. They're trying to figure out personality. They're wondering, is this student going to be a good fit? Are they the sort of student that we can see in our classrooms who would be a good roommate? Just what sort of person are you in general?
Right.
And the last question, depending on the school, sometimes they'll come right out and say, why are you interested in us? Yes. At Dartmouth, we didn't ask that. At Barnard, we asked that. It was important to us. So I would certainly be prepared for that type of match with the institution type question.
Yeah, and I know that quite a few alumni interviewers tend to ask that question, whether they were supposed to or they weren't. And so I do always want my students to be prepared for that. I think also you might get the question around what other schools are you considering, which we would say up, down, sideways, backwards, forwards. Please do not ask this question to our alumni interviewers. And that still, I would get interview reports saying he loves Penn and is also considering, and just a litany of other schools. And I am thinking the only way that this interviewer knows this is because he asked the student this question. So any advice around answering that question if it comes up? We hope it doesn't, but it might.
So it's an unfair question.
Yes.
You have to answer it politely. I would generally say offer a few schools if you can that are in the peer range, sort of similar selectivity. And if there are a few schools that are maybe more, one or two schools that are more selective and maybe one or two that are a little less selective, just so they can get a sense that, just you don't give them every school on your list,
No.
but I think it's, you don't want it to seem like, oh, you're my safety or you're my absolute reach. That's why trying to give them, putting it in context in a way, I guess, for your list would be the best way, I think, to answer that.
Yeah, and I even have told students, you don't necessarily have, it is difficult to sit there and say, I'd rather not say, that feels not ideal, right? But maybe what you could say is, I'm still, and also tough to say you're still finalizing your list if you're interviewing in February of your senior year. But I do think it's fair to say, I have a handful of schools. I really like this school. I'm also applying to A and B, and leave it at that, right? I don't even know if you need to give a longer list than a couple. If you're feeling really confident, you could say, you're not supposed to ask me that question, but you probably shouldn't say that. So never mind. Well, all right. All of this really great information. What is your advice to students in terms of preparing for these interviews?
So there's a few, aside from preparing, just asking yourself those questions of what do I want to study? How do I want to get involved? Like knowing those are typical questions, certainly, prepare to answer those. There are a few other sort of tricky questions that are good to practice. The tell me about yourself question.
Yes.
Sometimes interviewers start with this and it's such a doozy, but you have to be ready just to give them a nice little summary overview of who you are. Sometimes interviewers will ask at the end, what questions do you have for me? You need to have at least one or two good questions for that. And it's not one of those, how many books are in your library? Like, take advantage of the fact that this is either an admissions officer, a current student, or an alum of the school to ask them about their experience, what they're looking for. Like, this is a great, chance to connect. And the last bit of advice I would say is you need to research the school so thoroughly in advance, because if you're interviewing for a school, maybe that's not your top choice, they're going to know that when you show up and you can't talk about why you like their biology program in particular, right? Or what clubs you would like to take advantage of if you haven't done that research. So you definitely want to dig into that school a little bit to see what's a good fit for you.
Right. And actually, to that point, one of the things I tell my students is ideally you're not going to interview in the first visit. And that's tricky, right? Because what if you have one trip to go across the country and you're visiting a school where they do offer on-campus interviews, and it's the first time you're setting foot on campus? You don't even know if you're going to like the school, but that's what the internet is for, people. You do your research, you show up knowing what you like. Now, if you show up and you don't love the school and you know you're not going to apply, well, then now you have a practice interview and there's nothing riding on it. But if you love it, you want to feel really good that you had done your research so that now you can speak intelligently about what you like about the school. And it's never a bad thing to say, I've seen you from afar, I've done some research, this seemed great, but I'm taking the tour after this interview. It's fine to be upfront about that, right? But if you possibly can interview on a day that is not your first time you've ever seen the school, I think that can be useful if it's possible.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yep.
Any other last words of advice, Elise, before we wrap up this segment?
I know it's hard to say be yourself and relax, but the best, practice, helps, talking to a mirror, talking with a parent or a friend or a sibling. But they know you're a teenager. They know you're nervous. So just try to enjoy yourself. And if you need a water, or, a coffee next to you, it's okay to have that prop, something to hold, something to sip and take a breath. And if you mess up on an answer and you realize, why did I say that? It's okay to say, you know what? Can we start that over? It's
Yes.
normal. Like, it's a conversation. Like, these are human beings. They're doing this because they love chatting with students. So it's okay if little mistakes happen. Just correct them. It's okay.
Exactly. I mean, this is not like we're taping this and we're going to broadcast it or anything. We even get do-overs here, which you don't necessarily know about, and you can absolutely ask for one in an interview. I think that's really good advice. Elise, thank you so much for joining today and sharing all the insight you have from years of interviewing students. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Absolutely. All right, we're going to take a really quick break, and when we come back, we are going to be answering all of your questions. So why would you possibly want to go away?